First up, public presentation, the Fort Mill Southern Bypass Committee. Staff will take charge of that.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Happy to be able to present to you this evening the final recommendations for the Fort Mill Southern Bypass Corridor Overlay District. If you remember, this was an item that we talked about going back about 10 months or so ago, and council determined at the time that it would be appropriate to establish an advisory committee to look at the current and future growth projections for the Fort Mill Southern Bypass, and to come up with some proactive ways, proactive measures that the town could better manage that growth in the future. As we often said frequently during those meetings and some of the public meetings that were held, it's not very often that you get a chance to go in and take a brand new corridor and essentially start with a blank slate and decide how you want that corridor to look from the very beginning. So this is a great opportunity for the community to take some proactive planning measures in order to guide development in the future. The Fort Mill Southern Bypass Advisory Committee was appointed in the spring. It was a 7-member committee. Was chaired by Councilman Tom Adams from the District 4 on Town Council. We also had 2 members of our Planning Commission, Chris Wolf and John Garver. We had 2 property owners who own property along the bypass corridor. Chris Barton, who I believe is here somewhere right behind me, and James Trainer. Chris is from Quarter Point Ventures, who owns property near the intersection of the bypass and Doby's Bridge Road. And of course, James Trainer with Clear Springs owns several parcels on and near the corridor. And then we also had 2 residents from neighborhoods that abut the corridor. We had Donna Sigmund from White Grove, as well as Mr. Donald Elliott from Beckenham. And I would just like to take a moment to thank each of those 7 members for all of the time and effort that they put in coming up with the recommendations, the preliminary recommendations for the Fort Mill Southern Bypass Corridor. They had a total of 4 committee meetings as well as 2 public input meetings. The public input meetings all took place at the Spratt Building, and they were very well attended. Excuse me. The committee endorsed their final recommendations on October 16th of 2013 unanimously, and those recommendations were brought forward to the Planning Commission for additional review and recommendation. The Planning Commission spent several hours over several meetings reviewing those recommendations and coming up with what they thought would be some good modifications or amendments that they would recommend bringing forward to the town council for consideration. I think I did see one of my planning commissioners walk in, Mr. Scott Kokenauer, who's here this evening. So I also want to thank the Planning Commission for all of their work. We spent 3 meetings and several hours during each meeting, a lot longer than I think anybody thought it was going to take to go through all of those revisions, but they certainly took a lot of time and effort, and I also want to thank the Planning Commission for their work. We also, as part of the process, had a contract with Land Design, and Meg Nealon is over here to my left from Land Design. Meg and her team assist us in the Bypass Committee and the Planning Commission in helping to develop the language for the Bypass Corridor District. In just a second, I'll turn it over to Meg, and she's going to give you an overview of the overlay for the Bypass Corridor District. And I also want to thank Meg and Kate Pierce from Land Design. They put in a lot of time in helping us put this overlay district together. We did look at a lot of best practices in other communities that we thought would give us a good example for how we want this corridor to look in the future. And we also looked at a couple examples of how we don't want the corridor to look in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meg, and she's going to give you an overview of the Bypass Overlay District. As you recall, we did move this meeting up 1 hour from our normal start time, so we did plug in quite a bit of time. This will be a little more lengthy than most of the presentations that you normally receive. And of course, if you have any questions as we go through the process, please don't hesitate to ask. So with that, I'll turn it over to Meg Nealon from Land Design.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Thank you so much for this time to share with you all the details of this. I'm going to try to be brief as I go through this presentation, but as Joe said, if you want to stop us at any point, please do so, because it is a lot of information. Before I even get started, I want to thank everybody from the folks on the committee to the Planning Commission and even the folks who came to the public meetings. The input we received throughout the process, I don't know if I've ever seen such a dedicated group, because the level of thought and attention to detail that went into all of it was so helpful to us. And so what you're about to hear about is the details that are recommended for this district, and because of the level of effort that's gone into it from all the folks in the community who have participated, I think what you're really getting is an overlay district that is really tailored for Fort Mill, because of so many details about what's appropriate for Fort Mill and this bypass corridor in particular were really well thought out by the folks who had some input into it. So we really appreciate that. I'm going to try to follow along as much as I can with the draft that you have, and one of the things I want to point out is one of the first things that it suggests is some amendments in terms of definitions, and these are not on the slide specifically except for a couple, but I will point out some of the things that that are the definitions that are pretty much additions to your definition section in your ordinance here. The district, of course, starts out with a purpose statement, and as Joe pointed out, being able to create in advance of development really happening along this corridor, the guidance that you need to guide development in a way that is going to maintain the quality and character of this corridor, as well as the mobility of it, because to have a bypass means you're trying to improve the mobility around town. So that whole relationship between development and that bypass will be helped a great deal by this overlay district. So the applicability, this is something that was given a lot of thought throughout the process. We started out with the idea that every parcel that adjoined the bypass right-of-way, as well as anything that was in part within a 500-foot distance from that right-of-way would be included. So that was some fairly large parcels. If you go to the next slide, this was one of the original maps that showed what would be in and what would be out. The darker gray parcels are the parcels that are in the town's jurisdiction today, and the gray parcels are in county jurisdiction, but could possibly be in the town's jurisdiction in the future. But what you're seeing there is some parcels that, because they join the bypass right-of-way, it would take in the whole parcel. So through a lot of discussion, the next slide shows where we ended up in terms of applicability. This corridor and all the standards within it would apply to development on property that is within just 500 feet of the right-of-way. So if there is a parcel that is within 500 feet, it's in. Even if it's just a portion of the parcel, that parcel is affected. But what we've talked about as with the committee and the Planning Commission is that if you are just in part, a portion of your parcel is within that 500 feet, that's where the standards apply. As you can imagine, some of the thoughts that came up about this, well, what if I'm getting a site plan and submitting it to the town? What if that site plan has a portion of a building within that 500 feet, but the whole development's not in the 500 feet? Well, as we go through these standards, you will see that some of the standards apply to the building design, some apply to the site design. So if it's something that the underlying zoning would control, that's in play. The district has some things that would layer on top of that, and that's in play. If it's a building, if 50% or more of a building is within that 500 feet, then the building standards would apply to that building, but not all buildings in that development. So that's a quick explanation of that. You're seeing the dark gray and the light gray. Again, that's the town versus the county jurisdiction. You're also seeing an orange hatch over that. So where you see an orange hatch, we're calling that CODN, and that's, and I'll get to that in a second, but that is what we're calling the area that is a little bit more urban than the balance of the COD. So it gets a little bit more attention. There are some standards that that apply in the orange hatched area that do not apply in the balanced unhatched area.
Meg, can I interrupt you a minute?
Sure.
Could you go back to the comment you made earlier? If 50% of the building is within the overlay district, then the restrictions of the overlay district would apply to that building.
To the whole building.
Now, if 50% of the building was outside the overlay district, then the restriction in the overlay district would not apply to that building.
Just to the building. Now, some of the site standards would still apply within that 500
Okay.
feet.
Thank
That's
you.
correct. Okay, so CODN, again, it's really recognizing what was identified in the comprehensive plan as these activity nodes where you can have a greater mixture of uses, it's probably more compact development, and so what's described in the comprehensive plan is trying to be respected in this overlay district and encouraging things that really bring the buildings to the street, and the pedestrian environment in this area with that mixture of uses would have a very different feel. So the standards are adjusted a little bit to take into account the character and feel of what we're trying to create in those activity nodes. And that is, and if you look at the map from the comprehensive plan, there are those nodes. If you, it's animated, Joe, if you want to. Some of they're highlighted with these circles, and one more shows just sort of a conceptual illustration of what could happen in one of those nodes. And so it was a little bit more compact and a greater mixture of uses than you would see in the areas that are outside of those activity nodes. So the mapping generally responds to where those activity nodes were identified in the comprehensive plan. That's where CODN applies. The map that you've seen would be incorporated by reference, so when somebody's trying to understand whether they're in or out of the district, the map that goes along with this would be on file with the town so that that can be looked at and to determine whether or not a parcel is in or how much of a parcel is in. Where it applies, for the most part, it applies to non-residential development, multifamily development, and to some extent single-family. As we go through these, you'll see some of the standards that make sense for single-family, but when it's when it's not single-family, there are more details that apply, and your draft lists some of those exceptions. Existing development is not subject to this, but if there is some expansion of existing development, then some of those would come into play.
May I, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
On property that is not within the city limits right now,
Mhm.
I think two screens back it mentioned that it would become subject to this. If the property was currently zoned multifamily by the county and was in court and then later on annexed, this would apply?
Only if they're making changes. If it already exists and the town annexes that, then it would not.
Okay, repeat that again.
Okay, so if it's already developed, any existing development,
No, what if it's not developed?
if it's not developed and then you annex it
Right.
and it converts to a town multifamily district, then yes, it would apply.
You would still have, I think your question is, if you have a property that's zoned, let's just say multifamily, and it's in the county, and it was annexed into the town, you would still have an opportunity to designate what the underlying zoning district would be, whether it's multifamily, commercial, single-family, whatnot, and that's not going to change. What this overlay district will do is it'll put an additional set of regulations on top of the underlying zoning district. So you'd still be able to do whatever was allowed in the underlying zoning district, but it would have to comply also with the overlay district as well.
Right.
I understand.
Right, and that's an important point. That's probably on the next slide, that the underlying requirements of the underlying zoning are still in effect. Okay.
The word expansion, you know, being aware of other overlay districts that we have, oftentimes people want to renovate and not expand, but renovate the existing structure. Would a renovation also fall underneath, I mean, if they wanted to take it up additional stories, or would it not fall under those same restrictive conditions?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the height limits and things like that would apply. But in terms of, like the landscaping and things like that, that would probably not come into play. There are some terms within, or some provisions within your ordinance that define that, what constitutes an expansion. But the renovation, I mean, if you're really trying to take a building and do an adaptive reuse, get more use out of a building that would otherwise sit vacant. So that's not what we're talking about. So being able to move forward with something like that, that would not apply to that. The other note on this slide is the point that I was making before about if it's 50% or more of the building, then the building standards would apply. In a lot of or several places in your jurisdiction, you have development agreements in place. There's nothing about these requirements in this overlay district that would suggest that they supersede what the development agreement calls for. So wherever there's a conflict between these and the development agreement is what supersedes. The uses of the underlying zoning district. So for all the districts that are on the parcels right now, again, as Joe said, these are just standards that are applied as an additional layer on top of the standards of the underlying zoning district. So for each of these, the uses also, what's allowed in the underlying would also be allowed on these parcels with a few exceptions. We have several uses that are identified as prohibited uses, so even if they're allowed in the underlying, in this particular overlay area, they would not be allowed. Where you see a red arrow is a use that has not been defined in your ordinance previously, so we have definitions for those uses added in as an amendment, as part of this amendment. And there are two slides that are shown here. The next one, Joe. So probably none of those are surprises to you, but when you think about that overall appearance of the corridor and that relationship to those land uses and trying to minimize the types of land uses that would not be in character with what you want to have out there in making a statement about your town. Dimensional requirements of the underlying zoning district would also be in play. As you read through some of these standards, they are specific where it is about the relationship to the corridor, if in fact that is the standard, and then it should be clear where it applies to the whole parcel. So you'll see those as we go through. Setbacks is one of those. The underlying zoning has setbacks, and those are in place for anything that's not inside the corridor or is measured from the corridor. So when it comes to setbacks, these setbacks apply to that distance off of the right-of-way of the bypass. So in CODN, it's 35 feet because we would expect that relationship between land uses to be stronger between those nodes and the bypass itself. When you get out into COD, you have two choices. One is to go 50 feet or go 100 feet. And when you think about that, you'll see some illustrations here. But that 50 feet, it's trying to make that, create a setback where the visual impact of development on the bypass is minimized. If it's 50 feet, there's additional landscaping required because you are closer to the road and you want to minimize that visual impact of the buildings. If you choose to go 100 feet back, then you have less landscaping requirements to offset that visual impact.